Good morning, third grade. This is Miss Glassy, and today I'm going to read to you a listening and learning about how humans can change the environment. Our targets for today are: I will explain how humans affect ecosystems and the environment, and I will describe and identify human-made threats to the environment. We're going to review some vocabulary words you'll need to know for today's read aloud. Our first word is agricultural. Agricultural means relating to the raising of livestock and growing of crops. An example would be, Shanty bought the land for agricultural purposes, hoping to grow food she could eat throughout the year. Groundwater. Groundwater is water that exists below the surface of the earth. An example would be, when Jeffrey visited a local farm, he was told that the water retrieved from the well is groundwater. Leach. Leach means to leak or release. For example, Faye had left her watercolors at the park, and when she returned a few days later, she discovered that her paints had started to leach into the ground due to all of the rain. Pesticides. Pesticides are chemical substances used to kill pests and other unwanted organisms to prevent them from damaging plants or crops. An example would be, the local farmer decided to spray his apple orchard with pesticides to keep the harmful insects away. Smog. Smog is a form of air pollution that looks like a mix of smoke and fog. An example would be, as Roxanne drove away from the crowded city, she could see the orange-colored smog along the skyline. What do we know? In previous domains, we have learned about ancient civilizations like the Romans and the Native Americans. We have heard about different ways these civilizations have changed the landscape and parts of nature for their own benefit. We learned about how the Romans created aqueducts so that they could receive water from distant hills. We learned that Native Americans created channels to divert and store water in a process called irrigation. These changes made by humans can have positive effects, such as bringing water and therefore food to a new area. Human changes to the environment can also have negative effects on nature, causing more harm than good. Today, we will hear several ways that humans cause harmful changes to the environment. We will hear about different ways humans pollute important natural resources like water and air. You will hear how these different human actions have affected the environment. End task. After listening to the read aloud, you will be asked to write a 4-point answer explaining how humans pollute natural resources like air and water, as well as why it is important to protect these natural resources. You will also need to explain what would happen if air and water became too polluted. You will need to give specific examples of ways humans pollute and how they can affect or change ecosystems. Note-taking. You will want to use a piece of lined paper to take notes as you listen. Remember, you can pause the video or go back at any time to gather the information that you need. Please set up your lined paper to take notes on the effect of different forms of human pollution on the ecosystems within the environment. You can see here that I have made an example note sheet. You may pause the video and copy this same note sheet on your paper. On one side of your chart, you'll want ways humans pollute, and you'll write down these 5 ways: with farm fertilizers, pesticides, large factories for manufacturing, exhaust from smokestacks, and exhaust from fossil fuels. You'll want to make sure and leave plenty of room to explain the effect each one of these ways humans pollute have on the ecosystem, just like how I've left plenty of room next to each one of those ways humans pollute. Please pause the video and finish making your note sheet. Then press play when you're ready to continue. Purpose for listening. Listen carefully to hear more about different ways humans have polluted natural resources like air and water, and how this affects the environment. You've seen that natural disasters such as droughts and floods can cause disruptions to nature, knocking it out of balance for many, many years. It takes a long time for Earth's to restore its balance of nature once its natural cycles are disrupted. You have also learned that sudden changes are far worse than gradual changes. Humans are guilty of causing some of the most rapid changes in nature. Today, we are going to look at a few of the ways humans have upset the equilibrium of nature on planet Earth. We have made drastic changes to Earth in an attempt to meet our needs. Many of these changes are the result of the growing number of people on planet Earth, Earth's overpopulation. The human population has exploded. There are 2 babies born every second somewhere in the world. In 2011, the world's population reached 7 billion. That's a lot of mouths to feed. More homes are needed to house all those people, and more natural resources are required to meet their energy needs. Deforestation takes place, and this cleared out space is used to grow food and to build cities and towns. Grasslands and wetlands are also being destroyed for agricultural purposes, making space for crops. Some animals have been overhunted. Wild animals and plants are being squeezed out of their natural habitats to make room for all the humans, just like the deer you heard about earlier. Now, 3rd grade, here we've just heard about how overpopulation, deforestation, and overhunting have all affected the environment. These are all ways that humans have affected the environment, and they're important to know about. However, they are not examples of how humans have polluted air or water or other natural resources. So we will not be taking notes on any of these ways humans have affected the environment. As we move into the next section, we'll hear about the first way humans pollute the natural environment. We're going to hear about how chemical fertilizers affect the environment. You'll take notes on how chemical fertilizers affect the environment. In a natural ecosystem, animals eat only a small portion of the plants in their habitats. Other plants die and decompose or break down, returning nutrients back to the soil. Over time, humans have developed farming methods that have changed the natural order of things. In the past century, farmers have begun planting large amounts of crops. Sometimes they farmed continuously on the same plot of land, not allowing enough time for the soil's nutrients to be replenished. Once farmers used up all the naturally occurring nutrients in the soil, they thought that it would be best to add some of the nutrients back themselves. Some farmers use organic fertilizers in the form of animal and human wastes. However, more and more, farmers have developed artificial nutrients called chemical fertilizers to speed up the growth of their crops. Soil cannot hold all of the fertilizers that humans have added to them. Some fertilizers leach into the earth and contaminate groundwater. When the rains come down, the loose excess soil with its added fertilizers are carried into neighboring rivers and streams. Now, 3rd grade, I just heard that one of the ways that chemical fertilizers affect the environment is that they leach into the earth and contaminate groundwater, and eventually they make their way to rivers and streams. Make sure and jot that down as one of the ways that chemical fertilizers affect the environment. We're going to hear another way. Fertilizers can be extremely damaging, sometimes causing toxic algae to grow. When fertilizers enter streams, they help form large blooms of algae. When the algae blooms die, they deplete the oxygen in the water that is needed to feed animal life. Some of these algae have toxins in them. A toxic or poisoned food chain is created. 3rd grade, that is another way that chemical fertilizers affect the environment. They can create toxic food chains when they cause algae blooms and toxic algae. Listen now to hear an example of a toxic food chain, and you can even jot that down in your notes. A toxic or poisoned food chain is created. Tiny aquatic animals feed on the poisonous algae. Next, a small fish becomes poisoned when they eat one of the tiny aquatic animals that have eaten the poisonous algae. Then, a large fish eats the small poisoned fish, and the large fish ends up being poisoned as well. Birds and other animals that eat the large fish end up being poisoned. Links in the contaminated food chain may break at any level. As a result, food webs are also changed. Nature's equilibrium is disrupted or knocked off balance. Third grade, if you need to go back and re-listen to how chemical fertilizers affect the environment, go ahead and do that now. Along with the use of fertilizers, farming methods have changed in other ways as well. Have you ever driven past fields of corn or soybeans that seem to go on forever? In nature, a variety of different plants grow side by side, but farmers today often plant miles and miles of a single crop. Having miles of a single crop disrupts the balance of nature. There is less pest resistance, and when pests attack the crops, they do a lot of damage. Farmers then fight the pests with pesticides. Third grade, the next way that humans pollute the environment is with the use of pesticides. Listen carefully to hear how pesticides affect the environment. When pesticides were first introduced, farmers welcomed them with open arms. "What a miracle," they said. "Finally, we can grow plants with fewer pests." But it was too good to be true. The pesticides killed more than what they were intended to kill. One pesticide, DDT, was once widely used to kill mosquitoes and other annoying pests. The insects that were poisoned by the DDT were eaten by fish, and the fish were eaten by birds such as hawks and eagles. This created a toxic food chain. At one point, the bald eagle, America's national bird, was endangered due to DDT. The DDT made the bald eagles unable to have babies because their eggs were too weak to survive. Pesticides are unsafe for humans, too. Think about eating an apple. Would you want to eat an apple that had been sprayed with pesticides? As toxins build up over time, they can produce cancers and other diseases in humans. Third grade, what did you hear about how pesticides can affect the environment? Did you hear that they can cause toxic food chains? Did you hear that sometimes they kill more than just the animals or pests that they were made to kill? Did you hear that they can even endanger animals like the bald eagle? I heard those things too. Realizing how dangerous these pesticides are, farmers began to look for other ways to fight pests. Some farmers decided to try biological pest control. In other words, why not bring in another species, one that feeds naturally on the pests, thereby controlling the pest population without dangerous chemicals? But in many cases, this solution backfired. One such example is the case of the cane toad in Australia. Cane toads are named for the sugarcane plant. Here's why. Australian farmers brought in South American toads to Australia to eat the beetles in their sugarcane fields. These toads had no natural predators in their new home in Australia and began to multiply. Pretty soon, Australia had more toads than they could handle, and beetles were still destroying the sugarcane plants. Cane toads are called an invasive species. Invasive species are things that invade a habitat by expanding rapidly, often affecting the environment and organisms around them. Invasive species are moved from their native habitat to a foreign one, usually by humans. With all of the different modes of transportation today, such as cargo ships, planes, and trains, it is very easy to have plants and animals enter into habitats other than their own. Invasive species have the ability to change whole ecosystems upon their arrival. Now, third grade, we just heard that invasive species brought in by humans affect the environment. This is another way that humans negatively can affect the environment. However, it is not an example of how humans pollute air, water, or other natural resources. So, we're not going to take any notes about invasive species. Now we're going to hear about how manufacturing practices can affect the ecosystem and environment. Get ready to write down ways that manufacturing can affect the environment. Farming practices are just one of the ways that we have damaged the earth. We have also built large factories for manufacturing or creating all sorts of goods. Many of these manufacturing plants, which are often built beside rivers, have caused water pollution from the chemicals they dump into rivers for many years. Now, third grade, I just heard that manufacturing plants often cause water pollution when they dump chemicals into rivers and streams. I would make sure and jot that down, that they cause water pollution when they dump chemicals into rivers. We're going to hear a little bit more about how manufacturing plants can affect the environment. Keep listening and jot down anything else you hear. These polluted rivers and polluted waters often result in killing and contaminating fish. Pollutants from these manufacturing plants are carried up the food chain, even humans can become sick from these poisonous practices. Some rivers that were once a source of food for many people have become an unsafe place to fish. Third grade, jot down anything else you heard about how manufacturing plants can affect the ecosystem. Go back and re-listen if you need to. Have you ever been behind a car with a stinky exhaust pipe or seen smoke pouring out of a factory smokestack? These are visible air pollutants, creating a thick smog in many cities and crowded areas. There are also, however, many things that pollute the air, such as emissions from factories that we cannot see. Anything that does not harmlessly evaporate pollutes the air we breathe, causing problems for plants and animals all along the food chain. Third grade, I just heard that exhaust from factory smokestacks causes smog, and I also heard that it can cause problems for plants and animals all along the food chain. Make sure and jot down how exhaust from smokestacks affect the environment. We're now going to hear how burning fossil fuels can affect the environment. Listen carefully to hear how exhaust from burning fossil fuels affects the environment. Humans burn a lot of fossil fuels, such as gas, coal, and oil, for energy. These fuels release toxic gases into the air, and these gases become trapped in Earth's natural cycles. I hope you jotted that down. Re-listen if you need to. In the same way, mixing with the water in the air, these chemicals form acid rain. In the same way, anything you pour down the drain may end up polluting Earth's air or water. As you have learned, water is constantly being cycled through Earth's atmosphere, and all water eventually makes its way back to the ocean. Burning fossil fuels also releases gases into the air that trap heat in the atmosphere. This extra heat is changing the climate on Earth. Global temperatures are rising, and this has already affected ecosystems around the world. Third grade, so far I've heard that the exhaust from burning fossil fuels can cause acid rain. It releases toxic gases into the air, and it's changing the climate on Earth, making it warmer. We're going to hear a little bit more about how this changing climate is affecting the environment. Birds and butterflies arrive earlier in the spring. Plants flower and lose their leaves earlier. Some spiders, beetles, and grasshoppers are moving north to find cooler, more comfortable climates. Like the eastern wild turkey, they have been forced out of their habitat because they cannot adapt. It is hard to predict what will happen next, but there is much that you and I can do to help protect our planet from damaging changes. Next time we meet, we will talk about some of the ways that you can help our planet Earth. Third grade, now that we've listened to our entire read aloud and taken excellent notes, we're going to quickly go over our notes together. Let's start by talking about how farm fertilizers affect ecosystems. I heard that farm fertilizers leach into groundwater and then into rivers and streams. You probably already have that in your notes, but if you don't, now is an excellent time to add it. I also heard that farm fertilizers cause large algae blooms and toxic algae, which lead to toxic food chains. And I even gave an example of how a little fish eats poisoned algae and becomes poisoned, then a big fish eats the poisoned little fish and becomes poisoned, then a hawk eats the poisoned big fish and becomes poisoned. If you have the same information but you just wrote it in your own words, that's excellent. If you missed one of these 2 pieces of information, make sure and jot it down. Now we're going to talk about how pesticides affect an ecosystem. Pesticides cause toxic food chains, and again I gave an example. An insect is poisoned by pesticides, then a fish eats the poisoned insect and becomes poisoned, then an eagle eats the poisoned fish and becomes poisoned. I also heard that pesticides can lead to animals becoming endangered, like the bald eagle. Again, if you already have these things in your own words, excellent, great listening. If you missed one, now is your chance to jot it down. Now let's look at how large factories for manufacturing affect an ecosystem. I heard that large factories can cause water pollution from chemicals that get dumped into rivers, killing and contaminating fish. I also heard that large factories for manufacturing can lead to toxic food chains that can even make people sick. Let's look at how exhaust from smokestacks affect the environment. I heard that exhaust from smokestacks create smog. I also heard that exhaust from smokestacks cause problems for plants and animals all along the food chain. Finally, let's look at how exhaust from fossil fuels affect the environment. I heard that exhaust from fossil fuels release toxic gases into the air. I heard that exhaust from fossil fuels trap gases that mix with water in the air, and that leads to something called acid rain. Finally, I heard that the exhaust from fossil fuels cause temperatures on Earth to rise, making animals move to new habitats, migrate sooner, and causes plants to flower and lose their leaves sooner. Excellent listening, 3rd grade. Now that you and I have compared our notes, I know that you're ready to complete your 4-point answer independently. Great job, 3rd grade.